Raphael Di Marisi. I'm teaching a class in two parts today. So the first part is going to cover the aristocratic duel in 16th century Italy, and the second part is going to cover more of the early modern, so like mid 15th to mid 17th century middle class duel in the Holy Roman Empire, as we now know it as Germany. So the two main sources I'm pulling from for this are for the Italians. There's this book right here. It's called In the Service of Mars, Part 1. There's an essay in it by Tom Leone, who, if you have any fencing manuals, has probably translated like half of them. And then the second book, which I just finished reading like a couple months ago, which I highly recommend, is Anne Tolusti's The Martial Ethic in Early Modern Germany. So I'm going to talk about the Italians first. I'm going to switch my own view over to look at my notes. So if you have questions, I'm not sure if it's going to like make a sound if you put it in the chat thing. So feel free just to like pop in if you have questions along the way. I'll see what I can answer. Cool? Yeah? Anyone? Great.
Yeah, you're good.
Cool. So starting in Italy, first of all, I don't speak Italian or German, so I'm going to try and say a bunch of like Italian phrases, and I'm going to mispronounce all of them. Fair warning, do not take my like pronunciations too seriously. So the first thing to think about is that in the early modern era, both in Italy and Germany, you have these very honor-based societies. We like talk about honor in a bunch of different ways nowadays. The way they're seeing it is like your reputation is everything. You can't get work without reputation. You can't like go to church, right? Like if people in your town don't trust you, there's no, like you can't, like if you live like a big modern American city and like you don't do well at your workplace or you have like a tiff with your friend group, you can find another one pretty easily. But just because the populations are so much smaller, even like in the big cities back then, right, your reputation is everything. So when someone insults your reputation, you have to deal with that. Because if someone knows that that one butcher isn't trustworthy, then there's going to only be a couple other butchers around, and everyone's going to go to the other one, and you won't have any work. So in Italy, you have this honor code called the, and I'm just going to like copy and paste the Italian into the chat window right here. I'm going to try and pronounce it. The Scienze Cavalleresca, that's my best guess, which translates to the chivalrous science. So this is largely derived from like medieval and Renaissance interpretations of Aristotle, specifically like his Nicomachean Ethics. A lot of people aren't necessarily reading the primary source of Aristotle, but they are reading people who are reading Aristotle, which is like similar to what you see with Confucianism in China. So to quote Aristotle, he says that honor is the prize of virtue and is paid to none but the good. So if these are, so honor itself is like based on the virtues of valor and justice. We're not going to get too deep into all of Aristotle's virtues. That's just like a thing to have floating around in the background if you're like trying to set the scene for yourself. So it's not necessarily just an isolated attribute, right? It's not just this like one, we see in a lot of movies, like this one person out by themselves doing honorable things, no one noticing, kind of keeping their head down. It's like very much a social thing, and you have authors at the time talking about that, right? Honor is a thing that other people bestow on you. Now there are some authors at the time who disagree, like, you know, throughout all of history, people who agree and disagree. But the ones pulling specifically more so from Aristotle are talking about how this is a societal thing, right? Aristotle talks about how we're political animals, not political in the sense of like you work in Washington, D.C., but political as in polis, as in many, right? We are animals within a group of other animals. So these are all going to be defined by people around us. You see people like authors of the time saying quotes such as honor being preferred to one's father, one's ruler, one's country, and life itself, right? So people are willing to put honor on the line for like, you know, people aren't like doing these things lightly, but even if, like, let's say you get into a duel with someone and you're like, you've sworn allegiance to your local prince or baron or duke or whatever, and they tell you specifically, like, don't go doing this duel, right? Like, it's silly or it's not worth it or whatever. You, like, the social norms of the time are to ignore that advice and to go do this duel, even if it means you get banished, because honor, like, is the most important thing you can have. However, like, that's kind of an ideal that's being held up. So Achille Marozzo, this book I have over here, there's a couple versions of it out. Tom Leone, who we talked about earlier, has like a section out, and then Jared Swanger has the first 4 books of Marozzo, which don't include the section on dueling, but do include the section on swords. So he's a Bolognese master who publishes in 1536. He says, and I quote, "Although many knights professed to prefer death with honor rather than life with shame, the number who had acted in accordance with this assertion was small." So what that means is that, like, there's all these ideals of honor being held up. The actual reality of day-to-day life is often very different, right? Like, we often in the SCA get tied up in these like very Victorian notions of like Arthurian England. And then if you look at like what was going on in like the whatever like pick a century in our period, like things can get much messier. So part of the things we're going to be talking about are ideals. We will be talking about like some specific instances, but it's sometimes hard to pull these apart from each other from some of these authors. So these are not all groups at the time are considered inherently honorable. There's certain groups that are just considered dishonorable from the get-go. So a lot of these are like certain professions, so like innkeepers and prostitutes and actors. This can also mean like certain ethnic groups. So in Italy, Jews, of which I am one, like are considered, hence like the red hat, like in the 1570s, Phoenician Jews were required to wear red hats. Jews are considered inherently dishonorable. And this also can extend to your ancestors. So like if your grandfather was at whatever battle and he deserted, you as the grandson would also be considered inherently dishonorable, like even if like you are like a shining beacon of virtue. So independent of, so there's groups with honor, there's groups that are dishonorable, so as a negative, and there's groups that are without honor, just kind of like a neutral state. So those groups are mostly just women and children. Also you have, and this shows up a little more in the German examples, but like the clergy is largely like independent from this honor culture thing, which gets weird in Italy, seeing as like the Pope goes to war against other Italian leaders. But like your local priest, like isn't getting into duels, especially at this point. You have like in Germany, you have like the I-33 manuscript where you have a monk showing women how to fight. By the 16th century, especially in Italy, like the clergy aren't the ones wielding swords. So going forwards, the duel itself is seen as more honorable than participating in battle. This like might seem a little odd to some of our more contemporary sensibilities, but there's some pretty good reasoning behind this. It boils down to the fact that the duel, right, is just you, right? It's you and the other person. Sometimes it's small groups, but mostly it's one-on-one. Whereas the battle is a whole lot of people, right? So if you, and this idea of like both God kind of deciding who wins the duel, people still trained for them, but there's also this idea of like God/truth happening. But people are pretty cognizant of the fact that like if your general makes a poor choice in a battle, then you can end up losing, even if it's not your fault. Or if like literally, right, if you're in a boat and like the wind goes this way and your boat's going another way, right, that can end poorly for you. Whereas if you are in a duel with someone else and you lose, like that's just you. It's also important to remember that like medieval battles generally ended with about one side losing, like not so much sieges are a little different, but field battles generally ended with like one side losing 10% of their force. So this also means, and we're gonna see this again more in the German examples, but like putting yourself in a duel is an incredibly high risk situation. Right, putting yourself in a battle, you have a 1 in 10 chance of like dying right there, which like disease is a whole separate thing. But like in a duel, there's this like at least a 50-50 chance of one of you dying. Depending how good you are at parrying, it can actually end up higher than that. Another thing that's going on with like all these duels is we have a separate idea of like we nowadays our legal proceedings are interested in the idea of truth, and back then they're interested in like the duel is to prove more the notion of justice than truth, which like seems a bit odd to our modern like ears. But like even if right the accusations of the duel ended up like being proven false later on, right, like this justice has been served. Cool. So before we get into like the legal specifics of the duel itself, I'm going to open that Zoom back open. Who has questions so far? Anybody?
I'm good.
Okay. Cool. Let's plow forwards. Nothing from you, Finn? Right. Cool. Okay. So getting on to the duel itself. So Marozzo, again, right, published 1536. He gets republished a bunch of times. But like, so he's writing in 1536, talks about there's 5 justifications for a duel to happen, and you have to meet all 5 of these, not just any one of them. So the first is you have to have suffered an injury, which we'll get to a bit more in a second. The second is it has to be hard to prove via credible witnesses, right? If this is an issue you can just deal with in the courts, you're just going to deal with it in the courts. Like if I accuse Finn of like stealing my horse and I go to his house and it's like I bring some friends and there's my brand on his horse, right? Like that's not a thing we have to have a duel about. Like we all, like it's very easy to prove. Whereas like duels are slowly more esoteric in nature. The next thing is you have to be equal or higher status than the person you're accusing. So like a peasant can't challenge like their local lord to a duel. Like they would just shrug it off. They wouldn't. A, it probably wouldn't happen. But B, they just wouldn't care. So I can challenge someone lower than me, but I really can't challenge people higher than me at all. Generally, it ends up just being people of like the same like social status or military rank or stuff like that. Also, because we tend to associate people in our own groups, but also like people higher up would just shrug things off. The next thing is the cause needs to be personal, right? Which is again tied to this idea of like individual honor. This ends up getting played with a little bit. You see, like before the Spanish and the English have their big war, a bunch of Spaniards end up like hanging out in England, challenging local lords to duels and killing a bunch of them. But generally speaking, like this has to be a personal matter. Also, once again, like this is Marozzo's opinions, like what he's like a little idealistic. So there's definitely duels that happen that don't meet all these criteria. Also, because like the legality of this changes a bunch. But according to Marozzo, at this time and place, like this is what you have to do. And then the next thing is like it can't be something that's been previously tried in court. So it doesn't matter if the jury, if the judge came to a verdict or not. But there's this idea of like double jeopardy that we have in our constitution now, right? You can't be tried twice for the same thing. So if a court has already gone through this nonsense, you can't get into a duel about it. And then finally, we have another author who did not write a nice sword book for us, but gave us more ideas of dueling. This guy Pigna, P-I-G-N-A. Once again, my ability to pronounce Italian names is meh. So he's reading Marozzo, and he adds a 6th point to Marozzo, saying that the defendant has to say, "You lie," and thereby issues what we call the mentita, which is going to be real important in just a second. So, going through minutes. Cool. So, you want to be the person who issues the mentita. It's much more advantageous for you to be in that spot because the person who issues the mentita gets to choose the weapons. And the weapons are going to matter a lot more than anything else. What this does is it puts the burden of proof on the accuser, and it dissuades frivolous suits and false accusations. So when we talked about, right, the first point was there has to be an injury. So an injury could be, let's say, like I'm walking down the street and I see someone like kissing my sister, and I go up to them and I say, like, you are kissing her unjustly. The fact alone that someone is like kissing her is a public, like this is in the street, so it can publicly be seen. Like it's credit, like witnesses can just say whether or not that happened. And it's also like without inherent value, right? It's just like an act. But if someone's doing it unjustly, right, I am accusing them of doing this thing. So having duels as an institution in their ideal form dissuades people from doing dishonorable acts in the first place because someone will call them out for it. However, right, we need a check on just calling people out for duels, and what this mentita does is it prevents me from just frivolously saying that. So if I just say that someone has like kissed my sister unjustly, or that someone has treated me unjust, like has treated me like has done business with me in an unjust fashion, and they say you lie, they have issued the mentita, and I am putting myself in a lot of danger by accusing them. So the injury itself, right? Like in this instance, me saying like them having kissed my sister unjustly can like either be an action, right? Like such as the kiss, or it can be of words. So like me, like someone talking trash about me at the guild hall. But then the mentita, right, or like someone, it can also like the injury can be like if someone hits me or something. But like it's not just that they hit me; it's that they hit me unjustly, right? If I am talking smack about someone, like if I'm saying like this person's a liar and a cheat, and someone hits me, it's like pretty easy for them to defend the idea that they hit me justly, and I'm not gonna really be able to pursue justice. Like I'm not going to pursue a duel against them. The whole thing here, we talked about honor being a very social thing. So I need to be seen well in other people's eyes. 1 second as I scroll through. Cool. So within that, because rich people got really bored, they like made a bunch of rules. So there's 5 kinds of mentita, which I'm gonna attempt to pronounce right now. And once again, my ability to speak Italian is poor, so I apologize profusely for any of you who speak Italian. Cool, so the first one is the mentita certa, right? It's like a very certain mentita. So it'd be like, you said X of me, and I am telling you now that you lied, right? Fairly straightforward. The second one is the mentita condizionale, which is the conditional mentita. So if I made a statement of like, if you said X, you have lied. Notice that this gives the other person an out, right? If I'm accusing them of if you have said this thing, not that they have said this thing, but if you have said this thing, you have lied, and I'm issuing this mentita against you. If their response is, oh, I have not said that thing, then they don't have to get into a duel, and very specifically, they don't have to get into a duel where the other person picks weapons. You'll notice at each step of this proceeding, there's essentially the ability to like apologize and or jump ship. This is not like a spontaneous affair. It's like a very long, drawn-out process in order to get people not to kill each other. Eventually, in the 17th century, France kind of goes off the rails with this. And if you like leading up to the French Revolution, small sword dueling killed 1/3 of male French nobility. In the mid 16th century in Italy, they're a little calmer. So the third type of mentita is a mentita generale, right? General mentita. So there's 2 kinds. There's one is in regards to a person. So it'd be whosoever said X of me is a liar, or you can do it in regards to an injury. So you have spoken ill of me, thereby lying. The fourth kind of mentita is the mentita speciale, right? Special mentita, which mostly just means that like it's very specific. So like you like fill a name on the specific day of like this saint or this battle said this specific thing of me, and by saying so, you are a liar. And then the fifth kind of mentita, which I'm going to have the worst time pronouncing, is the mentita schioccia, is my best guess, which literally translates to a silly mentita, but more like realistically is the abusive mentita. So it's trying to goad you into dueling with me, and this gets really murky really fast, because if I clearly set up the situation too poorly, no one is gonna believe me, right? Like if I just like put up 5,000 conditions on this, trying to trap you in this thing, people will see that I'm trying to like be a trickster, that I'm trying to be unfair, and like it'd be easier for you to get out of the duel. But even if you don't, me winning poorly looks really bad on me, right? Essentially, like it ends in social death. And like we have a bunch of like more modern psychology talking about how like people view like social harms themselves, like we experience it very similar to like a physical harm. So like we are very much wired not to do that. So like a few examples of a mentita schioccia would be like, if you ever say X of me, you lie, or if you wish to say X of me, you lie. Or the worst one would be like, if you have said X or haven't said X of me, you lie. And then Pigna talks about this one really specific example of one guy in the room farts, and the other person says that the guy who just farted is lying through his teeth. Right, it's like it can get that out there. If you were trying to get into a duel, like these are not the best things to use. And if people see you're trying to game the system too hard, it's gonna end poorly for you. If someone says something like offensive to you and you want to call them out, but you don't want to get into a duel, because getting stabbed with a sword with 16th century medicine is terrifying. Someone has their mic on and they're like, right. You could, instead of saying someone is lying, you could say things aren't as you say. Hey, Elizabeth, you can hear all the rattling. Yes, no. Okay, well, I'll try.
A mass thing went out asking everyone to unmute their microphones for whatever reason. Oh. Whoever did it already noticed.
Okay, cool, thanks. Yeah, if you guys want to like speak up and ask questions, that's cool. But like, there's like background noise is not the best. We're all learning how to Zoom real well these days. Cool. So yeah, if you want to call someone out but don't want to get stabbed, you can just say like things aren't as you say, right? And it kind of like works to diffuse the situation. So we talked about how the person issuing the mentita, the defendant, gets to choose the weapons. The other person, the accuser, gets to choose the time and place. So the weapons, there's a few rules on this. So they have to be matched. So we often see like an SCA fighting, right? This is kind of like bring your best attitude, right? I can bring this 45-inch rapier and you happen to own a 36, or I'm really good at case and you bring single. That's not how dueling happened. Dueling, like the weapons would have to be the same length, of like relatively similar quality. This also extends to a few different things. So not only like what weapon I have in my main hand, but if I have like a shield or a dagger or whatever, in like or a cloak in this hand, it also extends to whether or not we are wearing armor, and it extends to whether or not we're on horseback. I believe it's Fiore, like he's a early 15th century Italian fencing master, talks about how like if two people are fighting on horseback, the better horseman is going to win. So if I know that this other person is bad at riding, I can set these boundaries, like I can set it up to make that happen in my favor, even if I'm not great at fencing. You cannot, however, do something silly like forcing a right-handed person to use a left-handed sword. Like that's out of the question. That comes across as cheating. These also have to be weapons that are easily available. So if you're both of similar status based off your titles, but you don't have similar amounts of money, right? At this point, we're starting to see the rise of the middle class, and the money moves away from just people who happen to own land and are given titles by whatever their local version of the crown is. To like the merchant class and folks like that are starting to have more money. So if the other person like just has this thing in front of their name but doesn't have a lot of money, right? I might, for instance, lend them one of my swords, buy them something. Oftentimes, what also ends up happening is you have a public armory, and we'll talk more in a little bit about how the difference between like citizens and town guard like gets really blurry then. So oftentimes city-states, both in Italy and Germany, will have a town armory full of swords and pikes, and they're not going to be like the fanciest things, but you can get two matching weapons out of that pretty easily. Cool. So the accuser gets to choose the time and place, but unlike the defendant, if they make this too much their advantage, it's not going to look good at all. So the location is generally like some lord's private estate away from everything. But if that lord is like their brother, right, then it looks really advantageous. And like you don't want to make it, or if I set the date for this thing, right, on like the day of your mother's funeral or something like this, that's bad. Generally, though, all of this is going to happen in about a 40-day time span. That gives people time to not only train, Marozzo, again, has a section talking about the duel in 40 days. But on top of that, also like allows you to get your affairs in order, right? You have to like get all your will and your legal stuff and figure out who's getting what. And also just gives you time to cool off. We also have Giovanni della Gocchie, who's like the last of the Bolognese masters. He's publishing in the early 1570s. Talks about how, although it is prevalent even still at that time for people to have duels with armor on, it is more honorable to have a duel without armor. The reason for this is because, we'll see again in Germany, the bigger the risk, the more honorable the act is, right? You're more willing to put, like if you are more willing to put all of these things on the line, that shows a lot more about your character than someone who's like just willing to risk a small amount. So once all of this happens, everyone goes home. The duel does not, right? I don't drop my glove on the ground and we duel out right here and then. These are aristocrats. They need to make a big deal of everything. So the accuser issues a cartello, which is a binding document prompting a riposta, which is another document from the defendant, the person who issued the mentita. So there's three kinds of cartelli. There's the first, which is like the regular cartello. There's the rogito, which is a version of it that's signed by a notary, right? And this is going to be delivered via secondaries to each other. So once I've issued this mentita, we don't talk to each other for 40 days. Because we literally want to kill each other, and if we try and like be in the same room, it's going to go really poorly, and all of our friends are keeping us away from each other, so that not only do we not make these poor life choices, but even if our friends are telling us to do this duel, to make sure we do it in an honorable way and don't just like pull a knife on the other guy. So the rogito is one of these that's signed by a notary and then delivered to the other guy. And then the third one is a manifesto, which instead of someone hand delivering it to you, is posted around town, like they paste it up on walls around town. In times and places when duels are legal, all these documents are going through a local judge. Which city-state in Italy allows dueling any given week changes a lot. I'm not gonna, it oscillates so rapidly that I'm not gonna write them all, because there's the borders in Italy are constantly changing during this period, and at one point France controls this, and at one point the Papal States control this thing, and these people are married to the Habsburg, so it's a whole thing. And once again, so people getting to sit down and having to write down a legal document, again, gives you time to think about everything that you're doing, reconsider this, and possibly apologize for all this stuff. So heading more towards the duel, so you have these 40 days to train. There's also the idea that once again makes into the US Constitution of you have a right to a speedy trial. So these 40 days is enough to train and stuff, it doesn't, right? It isn't a years long process. So you've done this, you've issued all these things, all the documents are sent back and forth, you decide to go through the duel. The grounds ends up being held on is called the Campo Franco. And then sometimes if you couldn't find, we talked about earlier how you try to find a local lord, right? And oftentimes titles are tied to land ownership, right? So you couldn't find a local lord outside of town to host it. You do what's called alamacchia, which means that it's on public land. So you think about we're talking in England, they talk about the commons, right? Here's a place where all our cattle could graze, that kind of land. So it's away from everything that's happening, right? No one's gonna walk through this by accident. And the idea of alamacchia shows up, it starts in Naples. We see a lot of it ending up in Northern Europe. It's very popular in Norway. I'm unsure as to whether or not they independently come to that idea or if it migrates from Naples. We generally see this very formal duel as originating in Italy, but the idea of settling your affairs violently is in no way unique to them. So you show up to the alamacchia, and then in the alamacchia you have what's called a staccato, which looks kind of like a boxing ring, right? You have a bunch of stakes put into the ground, and you have 2 ropes going around it. And depending on where and when you are, there's a bunch of regulations on how large it has to be. The duel itself is going to start about a couple hours before sunset, which will be more important. You'll see why it's important in just a minute. So even up until before you step into the staccato, you're given some chances to make up or apologize, right? Say oh no, you weren't a liar, it's fine. Because we really having all the nobles kill each other, we end up seeing in France, isn't great. You also have a bunch of people who are going to be there with you. So you're probably going to have an audience. You each have a second who at certain points of time is your godfather. At other times, it's your best friend or someone you know is very good at fighting, who will fight in your stead if you are unable to do so. They also end up inspecting all of the other opponent's equipment, right? So they need to check that there's not any hidden knives. They end up checking at some points for magic, because magic is seen as cheating. Right, they make sure that things are in order. When they eventually move to guns, because single-shot guns are seen as less risky than swords that can stab you an infinite number of times, right? They make sure that the fire mechanism works and everything like that. They're also there to enforce things, right? So if people break the rules in the duel, the punishment is death, right? Because death is already on the line. So the seconds are there to kill someone if they break these rules. Similarly, so the herald who's announcing all these things tells the audience that they are not allowed to make any noise during this duel. And if they do so, they'll be executed, because that would be seen as trying to sway it one way or another. The closest corollary, say like we have to this in the SCA, is you ever go to like the Panzer Champions fights, like they're really quiet. Like it's a very period thing, right? It's not like the loud cheering you see like the boxing matches these days. Because if it's quiet and then someone's delivering a blow and I yell really loud, it might distract one of the people to someone's advantage. And it's gonna not only like reflect poorly on that, right? It's gonna taint the victory, which is really bad. It's also gonna make me look like a cheater. So tell everyone like they will kill them if that happens. You also generally have a surgeon or two on hand for after the duel. And like medicine isn't good at that time. Like I highly don't recommend you get into a sword fight with 16th century medicine. But there's this idea I've seen in the SCA where, sorry, I don't have Chrome. There's this idea like that people will just die from like a paper cut. Like that's false. Like people got amputations a bunch and survived. Like they had immune systems, right? People like got cuts like everyone does. Like they wore gloves a lot just because they were like riding on horseback and you want gloves for that, or they're working with their hands a lot. But people like suffered wounds and survived. Cool, going down this. Great. So you have some doctors, like you have some surgeons on hand for the two duelists. You have their seconds. You probably have some spectators. If it's on a lord's land, you're going to have that lord there, and then also seconds. Yeah, you have all and a judge to make sure this is all happening. Great. Cool. So you step into the ring. The accuser, so not the person who issued the mentita, but the person, like the other guy, right? The person who's initiating this. So back to our example. If I say that you kissed my sister unjustly and you call me a liar saying that it was a just kiss, I am the accuser in this situation. I have to throw an initial committed blow. This is terrifying for all of those of us who are fencers. We never want to throw a committed blow because that's how you die. So this is once again dissuading people from just like accusing people of stuff, right? This is dissuading you from going out there and starting fights. Eventually, you start to see this like weird phenomena of people unscrew their pommel and throw it at the other person, right? The pommel being like this part of the sword, for those of us who aren't sword people. So anyone ever hears jokes about throwing a pommel, that's where it's from. It's because it counts as an initial blow. Depending, it's valid at certain points in time, but not all the time. So it's like a very location-specific thing. The duel continues. So we talked about this a little earlier, but losing outright is better than winning with like a tainted victory. So if you won because you pulled a hidden knife on someone, which is like we see in Talhofer, we have like a marital duel where people are sewn into like oiled onesies that can't pull a knife. If you like vigorously kick and punch your opponent, that's also seen as bad. Right, sometimes you would come to the grapple, but it's seen as like very barbaric if we just like keep hitting you. But like that's why we have swords. If, for instance, your sword breaks during this fight, I have to wait. Like if I kill you just because your sword broke, I am seen as dishonorable. There's like an instance that Tom Leone talks about where we have this one guy in period who wins 20 duels unscathed, and multiple times like the other guy's sword broke. Like I've been in fencing matches like where my tang snapped. And the other guy like let him go get a new sword before they continued this fight. If we're on horseback and I kill your horse, like unless we specifically talked about saying that's okay, killing the horse is also bad. It's not the horse's fault. Don't kill the horse. And then they keep like mentioning this, so like the fact that it shows up multiple times leads me to believe that someone tried it. Of like if I dug a trap or if I like secretly like put a hole in the ground that you don't know about and I win because your foot goes into it, that's also bad. And will reflect poorly on me. So there's a few different ways the duel can end up going. So you can win either because the other person doesn't show up or is a late arrival. So you have this famous story of Miyamoto Musashi in Japan, intentionally showing up late to duels in order to put his opponent off, and that would not fly. If the defendant confesses the other guy didn't lie, right, that's fine. The duel can end. If the defendant successfully defends himself until sundown, so they've created this artificial day of a few hours before sundown until sundown. Right? They don't have watches, but they can tell when the light is there. They're not doing torchlight tournaments. So if I said that you lie and I keep pairing until the sun sets, then I win, even if no one is hurt. If someone touches the ropes with their back, that person is considered the loser. This does not mean if you intentionally run back towards the ropes because you realize that swords are scary, you're going to be seen as dishonorable. So you can't do that. But you also don't do the weird thing that we do in the SCA where you reset every time someone backs up too much. And then, the more obvious examples of if someone is incapacitated. So if I wounded you to the point of you not being able to continue. So once again, we have this weird leg fighting thing in the SCA. If you can't stand, the fight's over. Or if you can't hold the sword, or you're clearly too tired to keep fighting, the fight is over. And the two other ways is one person dies, or what's really common, everyone dies. So even if let's say you get really injured and you want to just keep fighting on because your honor is riding on the line, and the audience can see that you can't feasibly continue fighting well, they're going to call the match. Even if you protest, they will call the match. There isn't people have this idea of a duel to first blood. Even until the end of the 19th century, it's seen as very cowardly. These were people died a lot. Swords are for killing people, and especially Italy using a rapier specifically. We'll see in Germany, thrusts are frowned down upon because I can just cut you on your arm with a sword, and that'll hurt, and you'll be angry about it, but you'll probably live. If I thrust into your abdomen, and we have 16th century medicine, you're going to die. So these were incredibly deadly duels that people took very seriously. It wasn't just to someone bled, it was so someone could not keep fighting or death. Cool, so that concludes the Italian section of this. We're gonna move to Germany in a moment. Who here has any questions about duels in Italy before we continue
on? You mentioned obviously if one person in the pair of the duel dies, they're kind of considered the loser of the duel. What is the approach you would if both of them end up dying?
Yeah, I don't have a clear answer on that. It's not great if both people end up dying. The matter tends to be settled at that point. But it's I know I don't have a clear answer to that. So I see, looking at the chat window now, Rick asked me a question. Hi, Rick. Sounds like the duel of honor is conflated with the judicial duel. Kissing my sister is an insult, but not a crime, where injuries to honor are part of the same system of legal injuries. So the judicial duel is a medieval thing. They're not particularly common. We talk about them a lot, in our circles, just because they're really cool. But we don't. And Tlusty, in her book, which I know you have a copy of, says we don't have a clear link between the two of these. So it's not this is an extrajudicial thing. Occasionally it's approved by judges, but it's also seen as the aristocracy being above and outside the law, and duels being the last thing between a man and his honor and an authoritarian society. So kissing my sister is an insult, not a crime. So it's not the fact that you're kissing my sister, it's that you're kissing my sister specifically unjustly. Right? If you were justly kissing my sister, it was fine. Cool. Do anyone else have questions about the Italian duels? Nope. Okay. Let's continue on to Germany. So specifically, we're going to be looking at middle-class dueling in Germany, or the dueling of the burghers, mostly because that's what the book I have talks about. The aristocratic duel looks very similar to what it does in Italy, right? Italy is very culturally dominant at this point in time. There's a reason that the King of Denmark hires Salvador Fabris, a fencing master from Padua, to go teach him how to fence. Right, the Italian art is in vogue, and Shakespeare sets his plays in Italy. So rich people are largely defined by Italy. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the middle class. So the first thing is that the first thing is scope. So we're talking specifically about the German citizenry, and the idea of citizenry at the time is much closer to an American 18th century idea of citizenry than a 21st century idea of citizenry. So if you look when the Constitution is written, you have to own some amount of land, and you have to be male, and then they don't say it out loud, but there's a bunch of race things in there. So this is not talking about peasantry, although they also had a bunch of swords. Women are not included in this group. Children are not included in this group. Jews are not also included in this group, although we'll talk about them in a little bit. So this is specifically talking about German citizens, largely in cities, but also in towns. So the first thing is that every citizen of a city, so if you lived in Nuremberg, part of being an adult male citizen of Nuremberg is you had to own arms. The rules on this change a little bit over time. The main thing is you have to have a sword, a polearm, and then depending on what year you're in, either a sword, or either a crossbow or a gun, and then once again, depending on time, some amount of armor. So as time goes on and guns become better, armor becomes less useful. So you don't have to have a full suit of armor. You just have to have a chest plate and a helmet. These are all things you have to be able to afford on your own, right? The state isn't going to buy you your armor. You have to show up to the fight with it, which requires you, once again, to be of a certain social status. We see the same thing in ancient Greece, where their version of cavalry, right? It's literally just people who can buy, and the word, even the term for chivalry in most languages means person on horseback, right? And in ancient Greece, it's literally just people who can afford to buy a horse, or generally multiple horses. So these are people who have some amount of money and can buy. And once again, there's going to be exceptions, right? There's people who are too poor to afford this thing, or they show up to muster with borrowed gear. But technically, everyone's supposed to own a sword, a polearm, armor, and then some sort of long-ranged weapon. It's pretty common for men at the time to be carrying at least a sword on them. Going about their daily business, middle class, and this is the aristocracy are still wearing swords in lots of other countries, but Germany, the middle class men are wearing swords all the time. And if you look at all the pictures, and the art might not be the best representation, but clearly if all of these pictures of groups of people have all of the men with swords, and even the lower class men with messers, which are technically knives but are very large and sharp, there's a lot of swords in Germany. We also see a slight differentiation, but not a slight. We see a big differentiation between rules about what's inside of your house and what's outside of your house. So, for instance, if you were a known usurer, or if you got into a brawl, or a variety of other crimes, a common punishment would be to remove your right to carry a sword outside your house for a certain amount of time. You can still carry it inside your house, which is really bad with instances of domestic abuse. But this is the idea of your house is your castle, right? This is your land, you do whatever you want in it. The state doesn't really want to get itself involved with what's happening past your doorstep. You also see sometimes men are specifically humiliated for a thing they've done. We have one guy whose punishment is he spends a whole year where the only weapon he's allowed to wear is a bread knife with the tip broken off. The imagery is like very intentional here. And their bread knives aren't like the large, like serrated ones we have now, right? It's like a knife for like eating with. So they don't have lots of forks. Generally though, even people who didn't have like the ability to wear a sword, so like even like Jews and women are carrying knives at this time all of the time, just to be able to like do basic chores or eat lunch or things like that. And you have like stilettos, which are intentionally made as killing tools, like rondelles, but like just a like utility knife, like not a Swiss Army, but like a knife for utilitarian purposes was really common. So at this time, you don't have, and eventually getting into the 17th century, you start to have professional guardsmen. But up until then, you really don't. So the reason you have all of these weapons, ideally, is so that when called upon, you can defend your town. Right? There's lots of wars going on. There's in fact the 30 Years' War. Sweden like occupies large parts of Germany for a good section of time here. All of the German states, even though being part of their own empire, are just constantly fighting each other. So like violence wasn't like state violence that you're like required to stop was like not an uncommon thing. You also have this like weird, there's a lot of tensions going on, and one of the tensions is that so like local lords, this is more so out in the country than in the cities, but still happens in the cities, of like they simultaneously want a populace that can defend itself. And this happens a little more with the guns than it does with the swords. But they don't want a populace that like can revolt if they get angry. But these two goals are at odds with each other and like cause issues many times. So your job as a citizen was every once in a while, depending on how many people are in your town, you would have to do a shift of guard duty. Now, rich people would often send a servant or someone send their kid to go do it if they didn't want to. Sometimes people were ashamed for this, sometimes they weren't. But you have to like go do guard duty every once in a while, right? It's going to be like all day or it might be all night. So these are not professional guards, right? There's not like training to like be a guard. There's not street lighting like we have now. There's just not a lot of light in these towns. You also don't have a professional police force. And you also don't have a professional firefighting force. So oftentimes, you'll specifically for guard duty, you're going to have a halberd as opposed to a spear, or right, we get the pike squares eventually during the 30 Years' War. So halberds were used more as guards weapons. They're not as good on the battlefield because they get tangled up in things, but they are often used as firefighting tools because they're good at like grabbing this piece of wood and hooking it over here. The issue, though, with having no professional police force at this time is that if it's your job, and like this isn't a thing that police have solved, but this gets especially problematic during this time period where if your job is you're walking around and you're not just the guard on the ramparts of the city, right? You're going like down the streets. So if you are walking by the pub and you see that your best friend is getting into a brawl with someone, but your job is to stop everyone from fighting because you're on guard duty. Like your friendship is going to be at odds with your responsibilities to your state, which often ended with the guards joining in the fight on the side of their friends. However, like if you saw like a fight happening, specifically like an unjust fight, it was definitely your responsibility as a citizen, right? Because all citizens are going to be on guard duty at some point. To like break up this fight. So sometimes people will, like if they see an unjust fight, we'll get more to that in a second, happening, they will try and jump in and stop it. So as state power gets stronger as time goes on, right, as like the state gets more and more involved in your life, you have like the even more local things, right? Instead of having like your extended family or like your guilds having all the power, right? That power tends to shrink into the household. So for instance, if I wanted to make a point of like dishonoring you, I could thrust my sword through your doorway or like into your window or put a knife into your door. And like that was seen as a much more offensive gesture than just publicly insulting you, right? Even though it's not tied to a specific thing, right? If I publicly like called your sister a harlot, right? Even though that's bad, it's not as bad as me attacking your home, even if there's no one like there for me to be attacking. And then, so you also have, once again, so even you don't have these formal lines between guards and citizens. Similarly, people get called into military duty really often. And thus, like the military ethic kind of starts to dominate German life. So the first place this happens is one of the big places this happens is in fashion. Right, so you see lots of Scadians dressing up in Landsknecht. And even people who aren't out in the battles fighting, like their clothing choices are often affected by this. And also the fact that you're wearing a sword, even if you're like a tradesman and you're never getting into a fight in your life, right? It's like a very military thing. And the sumptuary laws at the time would often curtail like essentially bedazzling, where you couldn't like put jewelry on your swords because that seems like not particularly Christian, but wearing the sword itself is fine. Occasionally they try and put laws on journeymen, right? Like these people who are going from place to place, like in the guild system, on their ability to wear swords. Also because A, because they're seen as outsiders, and B, because they're younger and seen as more likely to get into a fight. And then you also have we have this idea from history that like fashion and just like trends generally start at the aristocracy and work their way down. And that's just because the aristocracy has the most stuff written about it, because they can pay people to write it. But it doesn't always hold up. And specifically in this case, right, like even the German aristocrats are trying to dress like soldiers, even if they're not fighting. And then the last thing about the military ethic is, right, you start creating this culture where you have to convince people to like go over the trench, essentially, right? Like if someone freezes in the face of danger in the army, like it's really bad. But that doesn't always apply to like a healthy civilian life. So we're going to see how these things come into conflict. So the German idea of honor isn't radically different from the Italian idea of honor. It's just going to manifest itself a little more like in some other specific ways. So one of the things we often see is that, so you see, if you watch like mid 20th century American movies, you have like the two guys want to get into the fight, and the girlfriends are tugging at their sleeves, like, no, don't do it, fighting is dumb. And oftentimes you see the exact opposite happen in Germany at this time, of like someone down the street will be insulting you and they won't have stopped, and your wife threatens to move back into her parents' house if you don't deal with this because she is attached to your honor. So you have a lot of like women pushing men to get into these fights. It's also important, if you happen, we talked about losing fights a little earlier. In Germany, they have a really big idea of having died a good death. Right, so even though I want to like prove that I was just in my actions, I want the other person to be remembered well, and like these two like concepts come into conflict a little bit, especially when courts get involved. But people go to pretty extreme lengths to prove that the other guy, in the end, was like a nice chap. He's trying to kill you and like insulted your sister. So dueling itself is like incredibly banned in the military. And by banned, I mean everyone did it. So you have like there's a difference between like the laws and what's actually happening. As a note, it's 7 o'clock right now, so we've been at this for an hour. I still have a bit to go, but if anyone needs to hop off, I understand entirely. So yeah, so this, once again, so going back, there's like the over the trench idea. So especially like in a military atmosphere, these men are strongly, like if any other soldier from any other regiment insults your honor, right, and people are allying and like breaking up these allyships all the time, if any other soldier like questions your honor, your officer is going to look the other way if you get into a duel with this guy. You also have like church officials threatening all sorts of things. Like Catholics will threaten excommunication, and the Protestants will threaten refusal of burial in the churchyards. But this doesn't seem to like stop anyone. So the states themselves generally make dueling illegal on the books, even though that it keeps happening, and they're very aware of it. And oftentimes these officials themselves end up in duels. And this is an intentional thing. They're doing it because they know that, we talked about earlier, like having to put everything on the table, that people will try and prove their honor in like more and more dangerous things. So we have like a couple of officials at the University of Göttingen, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, I don't know how umlauts work, talk about how if they permitted bloodless duels, then the only result would be students participating in bloody duels. So the state is seeing like dueling as a thing they can kind of endure, so that larger fights aren't, and like large fights do happen, but like these duels are often the culmination of like specific individuals from different groups going head to head, and they'd rather just let these two people fight it out than like all hell break loose. So on the duel itself, right, these middle-class duels, unlike the Italian aristocracy, these middle-class German duels aren't like 40-day affairs. These are generally, sometimes they'll be prearranged a little bit in advance, sometimes they're on the spot, but even if they're on the spot, they require a certain degree of fair warning. So if you're just standing there and I pull a knife and I attack you, I am considered dishonorable, and I am, like, the two options are either I'm going to be executed or I'm going to be sent east to fight the Turks the rest of my life. So I have to be yelling at you from across this room. If I pull out my sword, I have to wait for you to pull out your sword. If I just pull out my sword and attack you, that's bad, right? The parties, even like we saw with the Italian duels, the parties have to be equally armed. We have a really weird instance where two guys agree to duel, and they show up, and one guy is on horseback with a pistol, and the other dude is on the ground with a sword, and they start yelling at each other, and the guy's horse panics and bucks him off, and he lands, and he fires his gun, probably by accident, and the other guy with the sword claims it was shot towards him. No one ends up injured, but the state is very confused as to what to do with this, because clearly these weren't equal arms, but they also hadn't started fighting yet. They were like trying to get to a point of equality. So the equality, like having equal arms is very important, right? If I just come at you with my pole arm, probably not welcome. But if I come at you with a sword and you don't have one, that's, even if I win the duel, I will have won it poorly, and it will end bad for me. And like everyone kind of even though the middle class rules aren't just like written down, they're very well understood by everyone at the time, right? Even now, every society has their social conventions that people on the inside understand. You don't always require formal laws to make that happen. If people though like see a unfair fight happening, they might step in, right? If they see a 2-on-1, or if they see that one person's dropped their sword or someone's on the ground, they're pretty likely to step in. Right, there's this chivalric idea of the strong protecting the weak. But if it's two equal parties just kind of fighting it out, they're probably gonna let it keep going, because they're like, most people are okay with dueling happening. They just want it to happen well. Another thing we see specifically, occasionally people get accused of cheating via magic. Like they'll put on like a magic salve of like that makes them heal really fast, or makes them bulletproof, or anything like that. Mostly this is used like as a after the fact accusation. We have like one guy who like defends himself against a bunch of people, and like, how'd you do that? It must be magic. And he's like, it's not. I'm just good at fencing. And this is a specifically huge problem in the military. So like, the officers have to make specific rules about using magic and why you can't, because it's seen as cheating. And then once the Reformation happens, all magic is considered illegal, which is its own witch-burning fun. So if you're thought of as using magic to cheat in a duel, not only are you dishonorable for having dueled in like a cheating fashion, but also you broke like the law of God by using magic. So everyone's gonna hate you. We talked about earlier how like the Germans didn't really like thrusting. So you have specifically Joachim Meyer, who's publishing in the 1570s, looks down upon anyone who any of these like fights thrust the other person, because he sees it as like something you would do with a hidden knife or a stiletto, but not something a proper swordsman would do, right? You'd hit them with the flat of the sword to teach them a lesson. They're really dangerous. You might cut them. But like thrusting's going to kill people because it's going to go into your organs. You also, once again, with these fights not being as pre-planned and as like legally involved, we'll say, as the Italian ones, you often see different terminology being used for the same actions by people of different social statuses. So people often describe, like, people at the time will describe someone of a lower status as brawling or fighting, even if everything they do does the exact same thing as like a rich person in a like just starting like a bar fight with another rich person, which they would call a duel. And then another like fun problem we have now, so the German word Schlag means to strike, and it's the same word that means like strike with a sword or a fist. So if the record just says like he schlagged, I don't know how to conjugate German, the other guy, that's all it says in the historical records. It's hard for us to tell sometimes if weapons get involved. So once again, so the state officials, oftentimes like showing up after the fact, right, like trying to mete out some sort of punishment, generally care more about whether drawing a weapon was justified, and not as much who drew a weapon first, right? So if someone clearly egged the person on a lot and wouldn't stop, the guy who drew the sword against them would be given a lot more leniency, right? Or like the accusations against them were like particularly severe, right? These officials are not separate from dueling culture, right? They're very much a part of it. And even though they technically say that it's wrong, it's like something they're very aware of, something they're brought up with. Universities specifically were really hotbeds for duels. There's a few reasons for this. The first is you have students from all over. So you have people of all sorts of different identities clashing. These students generally weren't from the town they were studying in. So you have this weird outsider dynamic of like and you still see this today in college towns of like people, like the townies not liking the students. There's like lots less swords involved nowadays, but this animosity can still be pretty present if you go to, I'm not going to name specifics, but like, there's lots of large college towns, they don't get along. And also the students weren't part of the town guard. Like they didn't show up as part of the rotations because they're not citizens of the place. Similarly, like Jews, women, and clergymen were exempt from town guard duty. We have a couple instances of Jewish dueling happening. Mostly though, if it's Jews against Jews, they dealt with it on their own, where they didn't trust the Christian courts, just kind of let them do their own thing, and B, they didn't trust the Christian courts to be fair. But the few times we have records are when like a Jew and a Christian end up fighting against each other. So they often own a sword, but they didn't like participate as much in the Christian dueling culture. But part of that might just be like the survivorship bias of the materials, because we don't have, like they weren't writing about it, or they weren't in court documents. Yeah, and then talk about that. Yeah, cool. That's all I got. Yeah, so like these are all social rules that are pretty strongly enforced, but everyone understood what they were. Great. That's all I have from my end. What questions does anyone have about duels in Italy or Germany? Go.
I actually don't have anything. That was interesting, and I learned a lot.
Cool.
Not normally my field of focus. I'm more interested in Spain, but I saw the class and it looked interesting, so here I am, and that was cool.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about what's going on in Spain. I would assume that the Spanish aristocracy isn't radically different from the Italian aristocracy, and we can see how there's a lot of parallels in the ideas of a fair fight across civilizations. So I'd assume they have things like that in common, but I don't. And I know they're using similar tools, although they're using them differently. But outside of that, I don't know the specifics of Spanish dueling culture. So the fact that they keep killing Englishmen.
There is a book on that you might want to check out. I found it at half price whenever it's back open again. But Honor and Violence in Golden Age Spain by Scott Taylor. And I've seen a ton of copies. Oh, sorry. Honor and Violence in Golden Age Spain by Scott Taylor. I'll put it in the chat line with the ISBN. It's from Yale University Press. And
Cool.
they used to have a stack of them at most half prices. They were one of those things that just came in bunches there.
Nice.
So I may have an extra copy somewhere.
That is really cool. I'll have to look that up. Who is it by again? Scott something?
Taylor. And I'll type it up in the chat here. Give me just a second.
While typing things into the chat, and I'm going to post this to Facebook, everyone saw it, but for college, my senior thesis was writing a 40-page paper about the duel in 16th century Italy, and I just kind of put it on my blog today, so feel free to check that out. I'm also going to put up my notes for this class in particular, because none of the German material made it into that paper, because I hadn't read that yet. But yeah, just like other things to look at.
Yay, new SCA blog.
Yay, Fool of Swords. Cool. Anyone else? Great. Well, if no one else has any questions, I'm gonna call it. Thank you all so much for coming out. And, hope you all stay sane.
Maybe just one second.
Too.
Check to see if I have one more source for you on the Spanish stuff.
Oh, okay. I want to learn things about Spain. This sounds fun.
I don't know if there's anything on the dueling side of things, but if you're not familiar with it, SpanishSword.org. That's Tim Rivera's site. He's out of St. Louis, and he's done a lot of translations of. He's one who did the Godinho translation, and he has some other pieces as well.
I'll have to look that up. I've mostly been following Puck Curtis's work in that, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but I do have a translated manual hiding somewhere in my shelf.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to get back to Distrace. I've been doing a lot of Bolognese stuff lately.
There's also, I don't remember the name.
Okay, I'm looking at the questions now. When did duels come about? They've been around forever. We're specifically talking about like mid 15th century to mid 17th century. But like the fact that two people solve their problems via personal violence is really old. I think there are questions I missed in the chat thing. End him rightly, yes. End him rightly with your pommel, sure.
I couldn't resist, sorry.
No, it's fine.
That was a great class. Thank you very much.
Ernesto, you got anything else for us?
I had to go run and stir food before it burned. Acta Periodica Duellatorum. It's a basically it's a collection of articles. I think it was Roger Nordling did them. Publishes it. It's out of Europe. But I know Charles Blair over in Chicago wrote a couple of articles specifically on it's a later style of Spanish fencing in the later 16th century, and it's responsive to Southern Italian, some Southern Italian styles that were developing at the time.
Oh yeah, I think Kai told me something about that. Yeah, they're complaining about the Neapolitans.
Yeah, the Neapolitan Sicilians started to develop something that had some interesting similarities to Black Tiger style,
Yeah.
So if you look at early Spanish texts, they don't have a response to that, but the later Spanish texts do. And it's not quite what the tigers do, but there's enough similarity there to have some
What is it? Marcelli? Is that the guy?
I don't know Mark.
No. Marcelli is like I think he's the Neapolitan master. That a lot of them are dealing with.
Let's say the ones I know are Pallavicini, D'Alessandri, Sienese. You can find a number of them on lulu.com because Chris Holzman's been translating a lot of them.
Yeah, I know my friend Patrick Bratton has got really into Marcelli.
I think Bondi Damaso, Marcelli, and Pallavicini are the ones that Tom used to refer to as the centers of that style.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm not a 17th century person, or at least I don't go past 1610. Cool. Yeah, I know Ken Montrine sent me some stuff recently about the Italians that I haven't read yet. Yeah, if anyone hasn't read these things yet, The Martial Ethic in Early Modern Germany and In the Service of Mars, Part 1, like, read these. They're so good. There's so many things. Great. Anyone have any final questions or comments or suggestions before we close out?
What were the sources you used for this class again? I know you just listed them. I was in the middle of writing them down.
So I used, there's a bibliography in like the article I posted for the Italian sources, but for the Italians, so there's this book, it's gonna show up in the reverse way, but In the Service of Mars, Part 1. It's put out by Freelance Academy Press. Tom Leone has a few articles in here, one of which is The Judicial Duel in 16th Century Italy on page 237. There's also a bunch of other just great things in this from Spain. Like Puck has a couple articles in this. It's a really great collection.
Good book to get a hold of in general.
And they're still like they're publishing it for a pretty decent rate. This one they had on sale a bit ago. It's like an academic book, so it's harder to get for a reasonable price. But Anne Tlusty's The Martial Ethic in Early Modern Germany is an amazing read. All of my German stuff came from only this book. It's so good. It talks about like shooting societies and fencing masters and dueling and wars and the Swedish occupation and tension. Oh, God, it's so good.
I'm going to need to get my hands on that.
I love it. Great, cool. Well, thank you all so much for coming out this evening. And don't get into any duels. Bye.